So let's talk a little bit about weed management. I've been a part of a lot of trials. Colleagues are a part of lots of trials. I'm observing things that you're doing, and I feel pretty comfortable to make a statement like this. I think the new technologies are good, but they need to be used best as a part of a system. Now, a colleague of mine down south, and it's a fairly complicated system, he's looking at it at a variety of locations, essentially is summarizing that the 2,4-Ds and dicambas look good, but in some of his trials, the residual herbicides look like they're the key. And for the folks that are tilling, tillage is also very important. So I don't really think that's new, but I'm just trying to suggest that I think we're seeing similar things here as well. Last year I initiated a study where the focus is more tracking changes in weed seeds in the soil over time. We know what the baseline levels are, and they're tremendous. And the hope is that through different systems to manage weeds, the effective systems are going to show a decline rather rapidly. And I anticipate that's going to happen. But following year one, as we tried to impose different successes, I think it was clear in the systems that contained residual herbicides, a yellow herbicide PPI for us, a different residual at plant, something in the tank with, in our case, it was a dicamba-based system. At the end of the year, those plots looked extremely clean. Whereas we backed away from the residuals, still used 2 dicambas in season, but 2 dicambas alone were not the same as those dicambas with the residual. So to me, the message is the new technologies will assist in controlling troublesome weeds, including some of our glyphosate-resistant weeds, but they still should be used with some older chemistries that I think will take a lot of pressure off of dicamba or 2,4-D or Liberty when used post-emergence. I've shared with you some of this data before. The attempt was to try to figure out the most important inputs. We always used a couple of foliars alone without any residuals or without any tillage. By the end of the year, those were really some of the weakest systems. 4 inputs and 3 inputs looked relatively the same. When we were down to 2 inputs and asked the question, which 2 are most important? In this trial, it was tillage and the yellow herbicide. Now, as I traveled over here during the lunch hour, it was clear to me there's a lot of fields where there will not be tillage. And I think in those fields, rather than tilling, I think there's some pretty good burn down, plus residual options that likely will be used by folks that aren't cultivating and are not plowing. You know, a paraquat with Caprock at plant should allow us to start clean if we're choosing not to till. If tillage is an option, this data set would suggest that it and the yellow herbicide were probably the 2 most important inputs. I was a part of a PhD exam yesterday, and the student was presenting some information, and in some of his work, he too was stressing the yellow herbicide, but he was also stressing the importance of one of our Group 15 herbicides early post-emergence. Group 15 suggesting a mode of action that would contain products that you know, like Dual, like Outlook, like Warrant. In his trials, those also proved to be extremely effective, and at times even replace the need for the follow-up post-emergent herbicide. So the benefit, I think, would be at least a delay in that timing, if not perhaps replacing. So lots of herbicide options I think we still have, even though the focus has been, as of late, some of these newer transgenics have really done a pretty good job at helping us control some of our most troublesome weeds. We're going to talk about resistance here in just a little bit, but I'm going to use this slide to try to illustrate a simpler point, and that is weed size with our foliar herbicides is just so very important. The purpose of this data set was to try to look at different sequential herbicides that might be used to replace one of the dicambas or one of the 2,4-Ds. And I think it is possible on both those technologies. But what was more apparent in these trials as we tried to do sequential treatments on small weeds, intermediate-sized weeds, and large weeds, there was a big difference. And even though you hear from folks like me all the time about resistant weeds and we need to be looking for them, I think sometimes a resistant weed could be confused with lack of control when we're trying to target weeds that are just too big. Too big for the Liberty, too big for the Staple, too big for the 2,4-D and the dicamba. May not be too big for the Roundup, but that's assuming that it's a sensitive population. But now we have so many resistant weeds, pigweeds, to glyphosate, probably on every farm to some degree. So we need to, again, be revisiting the importance of timeliness of our foliar sprays and our timeliness of the residuals to make sure that if it's active through the soil only, those products need to be out there before the weeds are emerging. And I'll say something about that in a minute as it relates to kochia. So same story on the 2,4-D side, so we don't need to look at this data set much. But again, weed size was important, and I do think there's opportunities, instead of going Enlist Duo followed by Enlist Duo, there's opportunities to interject a different mode of action that shouldn't cost us anything in weed control, and it certainly will help from a diversification of our modes of actions that we're using. This is a slide that I like to use in presentations because it illustrates small weeds that should be most sensitive to the herbicides that we're using post-emergence. But on the flip side, I think there's just such a tremendous population here. And to me, resistance is a numbers game, especially when we're talking about chemistries that have been around for 60 years. Those resistant populations are probably already out there to some degree. And if we tend to over-rely and forget about other modes of action, then I think it's going to show up that much more quickly. Last year, I was with a young lady that came and presented some information along with me. She had summarized, updated a publication that Dr. Keeling and I put together several years ago. I didn't bring the publication with me today. I would like to suggest, if you're interested, if you go to the Lubbock website, lubbock.tamu.edu, there's a lot of information in there, not just weed management based, but lots of folks that work at the center that are trying to make sure you're seeing some of the most recent information. But you can find this publication as well. This is essentially summarizing the options that we have in cotton. And one of the options that I want to highlight this afternoon, because I feel like this is the question that I'm getting more than any other question so far, and that is using the herbicide Reflex, or by a different brand, Sinister. And I think a lot of those questions are coming from this region. So first, I just want to say there's a lot of options. There's a lot of things that we can do pre-plant, at plant, and residual-wise in season. Reflex is one option at plant. And I think a lot of folks are using Reflex and they're happy with the control they're getting. And I'm going to second that observation. I think the active ingredient, fomeciphin, is a very good herbicide at controlling troublesome weeds and other weeds that we have in this region. I've looked at Reflex for a number of years, and a comment that I've made before is I can usually see where I have applied Reflex. In what I do, my farms are a bunch of 4-row by 30-foot blocks, which allow me to make comparisons. And usually I can see in plots where Reflex was applied, the cotton may be a little slow early on, and sometimes it's a little bit bronzed or not a real shiny leaf. Under normal use rates, which is 1 pint, I've never documented a yield loss. But I think there is potential, especially under lighter soils, or if there was some intensive rain that created a lot of splash, I think there is some of that risk. I think there's also the risk of knowing if something happens to our cotton, there are restrictions plant-back-wise with crops like grain sorghum. And I'm sure you're well aware of that, but I just wanted to highlight the question. The herbicide is good, but there's other things that we need to be aware of, some additional risks like splashing and restrictions as far as rotational crops are concerned. Now, I know some folks are also taking that pint rate and they're trying to reduce it and bring it down to maybe 12 or 10 ounces and mix something with it like Caprock or Diuron, and maybe that's going to alleviate some of the risk, at least the in-season risk. May not be so much rotational risks. So Reflex is a good herbicide, but I think Tolerant's a good herbicide. I think we've got lots of good herbicides. Thankfully, still, to help us manage weeds, we've got some newer technologies that we're 5 years in, and maybe we've got a new technology that we're a few years away from on the cotton side that I hope will continue to provide options to help us control our most troublesome weeds. So lubbock.tamu.edu if you're interested in this publication. And then here's a second publication that I just want to highlight. This is on plant-back restrictions. If you're in a sorghum cotton rotation, what cotton herbicides might be most restrictive to sorghum and what sorghum herbicides are most restrictive to cotton. We select herbicides to help control weeds this year, but we also need to be very mindful what direction we're going in the fall or next year. And hopefully this will provide some of that insight or refresh some of your memories on the options that we have and those products that are most restrictive. Another question that I've been getting the last couple of years is just the importance of Roundup. And I just want to highlight that I feel like Roundup still has a fit. I think we have lots of weeds that Roundup still works well on. Yes, we do have resistant careless weed, but there's a lot of other weeds out there that are still pretty sensitive. So to be using dicamba without a glyphosate or using 2,4-D without a glyphosate, Liberty is an option as well, but Roundup certainly on grassy weeds, other weeds still can be quite effective as a part of the system. Let's switch gears a little bit and talk about resistant weeds. What's new? What are you seeing? What are you hearing about? Here's a couple of things to consider. I think our greenhouse is a lot more active the last couple of years as we've tried to sample different types of weeds from across the region, bring them in the greenhouse, and we can do rapid exposures to different herbicides and look for changes in sensitivity. You probably saw this publication, not from us, but out of Kansas, a couple of years ago, a little bit alarming, where they're looking at populations of theirs, populations in fields that had not been tilled, that had received lots of 2,4-D over the years. They started noticing changes, and lo and behold, even after rates as high as 8 pounds, they're surviving populations. So I think it's real. I think their population is real. We initiated a survey last couple of years. We've collected lots of seed on the high plains, also working with a colleague of mine that you probably know, at least by name, out of the University of Tennessee, Dr. Larry Steckel. Dr. Steckel is seeing similar populations that they're seeing in Kansas. He has sent me some seed for us to help confirm the elevated tolerance that his populations have, and then gives us a chance to make some comparisons with our populations. I'm going to share with you one simple observation that I made, and it really is a simple observation. You know, when we've got glyphosate-resistant populations and we spray Roundup, we generally don't see any response. I don't. I don't see speckling, I don't see yellowing, I don't see stunting. I just see a plant that looks like it wasn't sprayed. The tolerance is that great. Even with some of the populations that I'm convinced have some degree of tolerance or resistance, every population that I've seen before after an application, at least initially, still shows the symptoms that our growth-regulating herbicides tend to cause. The epinasty, the irregular elongation on one side of the stem versus the other. Same thing on the petiole, the leaf cupping, the leaf strapping. Even the populations that survive initially show signs of dicamba or 2,4-D injury. But then is the degree of recovery, where some populations will stand back up and continue to grow, and unfortunately set seed if it's a female, and likely within the germplasm now has that resistance gene passed to the offspring. So when you spray, expect to see injury. What we need to be looking for is recovery, in trying to ensure that recovery is then faced with other herbicides or some means of trying to make sure those plants aren't producing seed. I'm going to share with you some interesting information from some greenhouse screens last fall, looking at both dicamba and 2,4-D. And I'd like to preface, I'm sharing with you some very early data, and there is no recommendation in what I'm sharing with you. But one of the things that we're after is documenting elevated tolerances and what things maybe we could use to overcome some of the plant's ability to survive. So lots of data, but I'm going to highlight a bar or two per slide. This is a Palmer pigweed location from the experiment station, and the 1X rate, or half a pound of dicamba, far left bar, still pretty effective. 10 miles down the road, another location that I frequently use for lots of trials, New Deal. Plants that were grown in the greenhouse, same size, same conditions, not quite as sensitive. And I'm aware of this field, and it's received lots of auxinic herbicide applications over the years, and maybe it makes sense that we've got a little bit of a different population, maybe slightly more tolerant. And then I should go back, but when we use higher than the half a pound rate, easily we can overcome any elevated degree of tolerance. Now here's a population out of Tennessee. Far left bar, 60% control. I'm convinced there's something going on in some of the populations that were sent to us from the University of Tennessee. I'm also convinced, based on what we've seen now in numerous trials, there may be things that we can put in the tank that will help overcome some of the plant's ability to survive. One of the things that we used, again, no endorsement here, or early in the game, one of the things we used was malathion. Malathion affects plants' ability to generate a piece of metabolic machinery called cytochrome P450s. Now, if plants that are developing an elevated amount of P450s are able to overcome dicamba or 2,4-D, malathion may assist in keeping those plants in check or in control. And we observe that a number of times. We're looking at a variety of other mitigation tank mix partners that may also show some promise. We also look at 2,4-D, and I won't bore you with but one slide. Again, a population out of Tennessee, a different population, 2,4-D, not nearly as effective as what we saw on our populations. And again, there seem to be some mitigation opportunities with malathion and other things that might help them and could perhaps help us in the future if, unfortunately, we ever start seeing some of these populations closer to home. Also, from a resistance standpoint, you may have seen this article. It's probably 3, maybe 4 weeks old now, coming out of Arkansas. Liberty herbicide on Palmer pigweed, not quite as effective as what they and what we, I think, have come to expect. Of course, for us, weeds need to be small. Carrier volumes need to be minimum 15 gallons. I'd like that 43-ounce rate far more than I do 36 and 32. And I think the same thing in Arkansas, even higher humidity conditions. I think they've been pretty pleased, but they're seeing pockets that don't seem to be responding the same. Do we see these populations here? I'd like to say no, but I bring it to your attention because we always need to continuously look for weeds that aren't responding the same to the herbicides that we're using. It happened with Roundup. It's probably going to happen with dicamba and 2,4-D. I hope not, but we're looking for it, and it also could happen with a product like Liberty as well. We're looking at other weeds for elevated responses. Kochia is one of the weeds we're looking at. We've got kochia growing in the greenhouse. We're looking at a variety of herbicides, and I think there are some collections that we've made where a normal rate of dicamba or normal rates of Roundup don't seem to be quite as effective. We've done lots of work over the years looking at some early burn down with some residuals, and this slide highlights some of the successes that we've seen. No applications on the far left, an application of one of the dicambas. This happened to be Ingenia, along with some Valor or flumioxazin that was made in early March. Sometimes we even have a hard time seeing some of those real small kochias, but a month later it was pretty apparent because the weeds continued to grow. I've got a presentation in a couple of weeks. I'm sharing the microphone with Dr. Adam Hickson with BASF. We're sharing some information back and forth. This is some information he compiled, and I stole it so I could share it with you. This is a population of kochia from a bunch of different locations out of Kansas, out of Nebraska, and out of Wyoming, simply looking at the emergence patterns of this particular weed, kochia. And this data set would suggest, and I have no reason to think ours is going to be that different, there's a fairly narrow window when we tend to see kochia emerging. Of course, kochia likes a little bit of moisture. So if there's no moisture, then maybe there's no emergence. But if there's moisture, kochia is going to come up early over a relatively narrow window, starting in March and ending for the most part in April. So when we think about timeliness of herbicide applications, if it's residual based, then we need to get it out there when that kochia isn't up yet. Or if we throw something in there like dicamba, hopefully the dicamba will burn the small ones, and then the residual valor is going to prevent later emerging weeds. I think other weeds show similar patterns of early emergence only. Common lamb's quarter I would put in a similar category. Opposite would be a weed like Palmer pigweed, where it primarily may come up in May, but there's still a tremendous opportunity for weeds coming up in June and July and August and September and October and November. And we've got data that shows exactly that. And even those coming up in October and November have capabilities of producing 100 or so seed. Okay. So timeliness, oftentimes we think of weed size for the foliar herbicide, but I think timeliness also means trying to make sure that the residuals are in place prior to the possibility of those weeds coming because the soil temperature is right for emergence to occur. How we doing? Doing okay? I will say I'm used to talking to my computer. I had my first live extension presentation about a month ago, and I was pretty excited. I'm excited to see this group too. It's a group that I always like to visit with, but again, the basketball news has just kind of dampened my mood. A few other things I'd like to share with you, unless you want to stop me and ask a question on anything that maybe I've said so far. You know, volunteer cotton can be a difficult to control weed. And there are things that we can do to control some of our volunteers that you're aware of. You know, paraquat works pretty well. Paraquat under a hood or paraquat before our planted cotton is up. You know, there's other things that we can use if they're small. There's activity from products like, you know, AIM or ET. There's activity from Bucktrol. Our focus in this trial was to try to look at the new transgenic cottons and relying on the opposite herbicide technology. So we were trying to control volunteer XtendFlex cotton with Enlist, and we were trying to control volunteer Enlist cotton with one of the dicambas. And let me just try to quickly share with you some slides as to what we've observed the last couple of years in Lubbock, and similar trials are being done downstate and across the border into Oklahoma. So let me just mention, in this particular case, we're controlling volunteer Enlist with dicamba. Dicamba is not as effective maybe as 2,4-D, and we know that. Cotton is more sensitive to 2,4-D. These 4 photos show dicamba applied once, applied at 2-leaf once, applied at 5-leaf once, applied at first square once, applied at bloom once, and one application isn't going to be good enough. This series of slides show 2 dicambas, 2 certainly better than 1. I think where we saw the most effective control by the end of the season was a 2-leaf followed by square. Now, we took these plots to yield to show the competition potential from volunteer cotton. And sure enough, where we weren't effective at controlling the volunteer in this dry land setting, we saw yield loss in every plot except for the one that I highlighted, a two-leaf followed by square. Now, the opposite technology, we saw things similar, but then maybe slightly different. This is, again, the series of single applications of Enlist 1, controlling volunteer extend flex. So this is a two-leaf once, this is five-leaf, this is square, this is bloom. You know, maybe better, but not great. And here's a bunch of sequentials, and probably all of the sequentials really looked pretty good. So again, we've got opportunities to use a variety of things, including paraquat, but if we're relying on the dicamba or relying on the 2,4-D, we may need two applications. We took these to yield as well. I should have flipped this slide earlier. And with one exception, we did document yield loss where we just used one spray at bloom. Everything else yielded similar to our weed-free unsprayed control. All right, I'm going to switch gears again. I'm going to share with you an update that I didn't share with you last year. Remember, we buried some seed 5 years ago plus 1 day. And I know it was the anniversary yesterday because I actually sent a text to my old technician who helped bury these seeds 5 years ago. Yesterday was our last extraction where we went out and we dug up the seed that we had buried 5 years ago. But we've been digging up seed for the last 5 years. After 6 months, 12 months, 24 months, 36, 48, looking for changes in seed viability. We buried seed in Lubbock, colleagues buried seed in Corpus, College Station, Fayetteville, Arkansas. So many locations within and out of state. Seed that were buried shallow, seed that were buried deep. Bottom line pretty much is this. Seed viability of Palmer pigweed declines rapidly. Rapidly. Last year I may have asked you to play along and ask how long are weed seeds viable in the soil, and you probably hollered out a variety of answers. Probably Mark Appling hollered out, field bindweed lasts for 80, 90 years. Mark's a pretty smart guy, that's true. But on Palmer pigweed, what's the answer? Well, we didn't know, which was the reason we did this trial, and I'm going to say 5 years later, I'm feeling pretty good to know that some of our seed that were shattered 5 years ago are probably not going to cause lots of problems in the growing season 2021. Now, you can argue pigweed produces so many seed, even if the viability is low, 1% of a million seed is a pretty good number, and you're absolutely right. On the flip side, if you need any, carrot to be dangled in front of you, that maybe that additional input or attempt to make sure that later emerging weeds aren't producing seed that are going to shatter, it seems like sooner rather than later, some effective control strategies over a relatively few years has the capability of bringing some of our weed seed levels in the soil down a tremendous amount. We did this for Palmer pigweed. We did this to a sister weed called water hemp. Again, multiple locations. These are the numbers, and we're at less than 2% from our Lubbock location, regardless of if the seeds were shallow, 2 inches, or if the seeds were deep, 8 to 10 inches. So to me, that's good news. The last extraction, like I said, was yesterday. If I'm invited back next year, I can share with you the complete 5-year data set. We also had a second burial that will last for 3 years. It was done pretty much at the same location. In the 3rd year, extraction is going to take place this fall. So this study will be done other than maybe some of the analysis of the seed viability. The reason for the second run was just to try to make sure that our seed source the first time just wasn't a little bit, I guess, non-vigorous. That Palmer pigweed is Palmer pigweed. That's the hope. We continue to talk about the importance of on-target application. I know you're continuing to stress the need for on-target application, especially when we're using hormone-type herbicides that will cause symptomology at extremely low rates. We're also trying to get a better handle on when events occur, what does that mean from a yield and a quality standpoint? We have wrapped up a 3-year study with dicamba. And one of my, I guess, summaries would be at certain rates, it seems like the cotton has the ability to compensate. And there were some bolls that were produced, if not higher up the plant, maybe a little bit further out, because we were looking at changes in boll distribution. Now we're in the middle of a study where we're looking at 2,4-D. Let me just share with you a few slides on some things that we're learning. First of all, this is a slide, I think it's kind of interesting. I don't know how well you can see it. This is an Extend Flex variety. We used a series of rates of 2,4-D from as low as 1/1,000th of an X rate, 1/500th, 1/100th, 1/50th, 1/10th, and the full rate. And what we saw was the higher the rate, the more the injury. Okay, you already knew that. But to me, what was less apparent is when we took a given rate, and we're going to focus on this 1/10th X rate, when we used a given rate and exposed to different growth stages of cotton, I saw a tremendous difference in cotton's ability to exude symptoms and perhaps recover, or have a greater ability to recover. Obviously, dose matters, but I think also what we're learning is when the event occurs, and we're even trying to focus on different maturity levels or classifications of cotton, there's a lot that we can learn. This data shows the boll distribution. Now, what I don't have was the dicamba, but I made reference earlier, there's a shift. A little bit of injury, we saw a few more bolls higher up and further out. We're not seeing that with 2,4-D. 2,4-D doing a much better job of shutting down the plant. I mean, we took these to yield, and in the worst year, pretty much every concentration or rate at every growth stage, with one outlier, every time we saw yield loss. We're looking at quality as well. This is a 3-year study. This will be the 3rd year this year. Again, the focus is on target application. That's what we're all striving for. But at the same time, we're trying to learn more what happens when some of our product gets away. HPPD tolerant cotton will be the next technology, I believe, on the cotton side. We're a few years away. We've had a chance to work with BASF for a number of years, looking at the tolerance with the current germplasm that we have, and also look at an HPPD inhibiting herbicide as a part of a program. So the herbicide that we're using, our HPPD inhibitor, the common name is isoxaflutol. The current trade name in corn is Balance. It will be called something different on the cotton side. But I do like what I see. I do see good tolerance to the lines that I've been given access to, and I like the weed control. I think Balance is a good herbicide on a number of weeds that we're trying to control. The student that was here with you last year, Delaney Foster, she's now pursuing a PhD at the University of Tennessee. Her trial, which went belt-wide all the way to Georgia, looked at tank mix partners in the various regions. What she was interested in is determining kind of a baseline level of control that we might expect to see 42 days after application. Depending on the region, that level of control changed over time, sometimes very quickly. I think some of the regions with much higher rainfall potential, the herbicide didn't last as long. Here for us, 42 days after we sprayed, we still had greater than 90% control of Palmer pigweed. In other products that were used in tank mixture, some of our PS2 inhibiting herbicides like Cotoran or Diuron or Caprock and other products as well seem to bring that level of control even closer to 100%. So it's technology I think we can look forward to. Just like Dicamba 2,4-D, Roundup Liberty, it's not going to be standalone, but it will provide another opportunity to use a different mode of action in cotton. And I believe if used appropriately in a system with other modes of action, should be able to assist in managing current weed-resistant populations and hopefully delaying any new ones further down the road. I'd like to say a few things about sorghum, and it will be just a few. Speaking of new technologies, there are some new things coming forward on the sorghum side, and if you haven't heard it, then maybe I can be the deliverer of a few names that I hope you are familiar with. There will be Corteva's InZen sorghum. We've actually looked at InZen sorghum now for years, back when it was DuPont. The herbicide that's used in this system, the active ingredient, is nicosulfuron. In sorghum, the branded name is going to be Zest. It will provide an opportunity to control somewhat of a broad spectrum of weeds, but really the focus is on grasses. The nicosulfuron has pretty good grass activity. Grassy weeds like barnyard grass, some of our panicum species, foxtail species. Soft launch in 2021, and I'm told a really soft launch. They're targeting specific growers, so there may be an opportunity for some folks in this region to see what Zest might bring to the table in an InZen sorghum system. A little bit newer, but also available in 2021 is Advanta's iGrowth sorghum. iGrowth sorghum is coupled with the herbicide. The common name is Amazamox. Amazamox is currently used in other crops, but in sorghum, Amazamox is going to be called Imiflex. So Imiflex herbicide, also the opportunity to control grassy weeds, in this case, both soil activity and early post-emergence. This technology, new in 2021, probably a little bit more available than the InZen. And then lastly, and last year I had a chance to look at this technology from S&W Seeds called Double Team Sorghum. The technology is there for tolerance to an active ingredient called quizalofop. It's one of our post-grass inhibiting herbicides. It's going to be branded, quizalofop will be branded First Act. First Act is a foliar herbicide, activity on grassy weeds only. So we've got pretty good options in sorghum to control broadleaf weeds. We've got options in grasses, but I think now we've got a lot more options that might assist both from a soil residual, but also from the standpoint of grassy weeds growing with my sorghum. And with the right technology, we've got herbicide options now that we can use. Obviously, we're going to continue to try to evaluate in 2021, but so far what I've seen, the germplasm that's been provided, the herbicides that we've sprayed, the tolerance has been good, and activity on grassy weeds is what we would expect because these aren't new herbicides, just new for sorghum. Last new technology I want to share with you, and it's new to me, was some precision cultivation. These are some finger weeders that I had a chance to look at a grower down in Tahoka, run some of these finger weeders at assisting in weeds that were growing essentially in the row. So we put together a 4-row sprayer, and we tried to see how effective it would be on different sized weeds. This is what our sprayer looks like. I don't know if this is going to work. Looks like we're moving. This one wasn't supposed to be slow motion, but I've got some weeds that are growing there in the row. Here comes my finger weeder. You'll notice the degree of soil movement that occurs as this finger weeder is moving through. As you can imagine, if you get off row a little bit, cotton might not be too happy when it's small. I actually did see a few weeds that were the size of the cotton that were uprooted, but I wouldn't rely on that consistently. Again, the lighting in this room isn't the best. I've got a tremendous population of really, really small careless weeds before, and they're gone after. We did an awful lot of counts. We ran this equipment at least 3 different times. Every time we ran some water across the field and promoted a subsequent flush. I think there's some opportunities. These finger weeders come with different pliable fingers. Of course, there was a big art to it for us first time to try to make sure that things were set properly. Also on a pretty big steep learning curve, learning the importance of driving straight. GPS definitely would help. And the grower that's several years into these finger weeders has been very pleased with what he is seeing. That weed in this video would be removed, but that's again a little bit bigger than what I would normally like to get. Last thing I want to say, and I'll be quiet, we're also trying to look at some UAV technologies to do a few different things in the field, to try to see how accurate maybe detecting either escaped weeds when they're small, herbicide drift if it occurs. Can we start picking up even differences based on the reflectance on some different chemistries? We're a couple of years in. I know there's some people that are much further along. I was a part of a conference a few months ago where they were looking at sprayers or UAVs that had the capabilities to spray, and they were trying to track resistant populations following an initial spray, and they were bringing the drones back and making some spot sprays, and it looked pretty impressive. In this particular case, taking advantage of plots that were already out in the field, lots of low rates of 2,4-D, looked at a bunch of different vegetation indices, tried to modify the background soil appearance, and I'm just going to summarize it this way. The greatest rates of the herbicide were the ones that are easiest to detect from above. Some of the marginal rates that sometimes even difficult for you and I to see, we weren't very successful at finding some of those from above. Okay? So a lot of work ahead, but I think there are some capabilities on the weed management side that may allow us to do a few things a little bit differently, maybe a little bit more efficient. But right now, everything we're trying to do is to ground truth it initially, make some observations with us in the field, and see how effective we may have been had we essentially flown over and looked at some kind of reflectance data to help determine new flushes of weeds or perhaps some herbicide damage. I think that's it for me. Acknowledging my team who put a lot of this data together, graduate students at Texas Tech.